Today's episode of The Unmistakable Creative is brought to you by Selz. That's SELZ.com. With Selz, you can add your products and sell from any site in minutes without any complicated setup or hassle. They handle the payments when a customer buys and send you the money while providing your customer with a completely seamless experience.
In spite of all our communication technology, no invention is as effective as the sound of the human voice. When we hear the human voice, we instinctively want to listen in the hopes of understanding it, even when the speaker is searching for the right words to say. That's because the human voice resonates differently from everything else in the world. This is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. Listen in on candid conversations with creative entrepreneurs and insanely interesting people.
In this episode of The Unmistakable Creative, Pamela Slim returns to the show to discuss her latest book, Body of Work. A stable career in any field is quickly becoming obsolete, and by creating a body of work, we can navigate the uncertain world of work that lies ahead of us. So listen in for how you can navigate your own future and create your body of work. Pam, welcome to The Unmistakable Creative.
Thank you so much. 3 times. Boy, I feel really special. I am so glad to be back here.
Yeah, I think that, it's funny. We've had you at the very beginning of this. We had you one more time when we were kind of finishing up our stint as Blogcast FM. And, even though it hasn't been that long since we had you here, one of the reasons I really wanted to have you back is because I felt that the content of the new book, this whole idea of a body of work, is something that has been very transformative for me, and the people in our community are creatives, and I think to get their head around that idea, I think is really something important, because I feel like it just unlocks so many things. But before we do that, I'd love for you to kind of walk us through a little bit of your story, that kind of and how that has led to this book.
Yeah, it's interesting because whenever you write a book, and you've written books, so you know this, that the journey itself of writing is often also one in which you learn all kinds of things about yourself. And I know for me that was really the case with Body of Work, not just myself, but also my dad, who's a central figure in the book. And what was initially driving me to write the book is after having done so many things in my own career. I've worked in just about every work mode you can imagine. I was in nonprofit work early on in my career. In college, I was an international service and development major with a focus in education in Latin America. And I thought I was just going to be an expatriate aid worker when I was young and optimistic. I'm still optimistic, just not as young. But I did that. I worked in nonprofits. I worked in nonprofit education at the Exploratorium. And then I slowly wound my way into more business and corporate life, ending up at Barclays Global Investors, which is a big financial services firm in San Francisco, but in the field of training and development. And I've always found that being on the human side of business is something that was just really interesting to me. When I had kids, I was a stay-at-home mom for a year, which is when I started my blog, Escape from Cubicle Nation, about 8 years ago. And then I've also been a consultant to large companies. I did that for about 10 years when I first started my business. And then the last 8 years, I've been working in startup. So there's something that I realized from my own journey of enjoying the fact that I've worked in so many different arenas. And to be perfectly frank about it, I never, ever considered that a problem. I never looked like, oh my God, my work history is kind of all over the place. Like, what a drag. And that's a very common feeling that I'll get, an experience that I'll get from people that I'm working with. And to me, it was just like the most obvious thing in the world. Like, of course, right? That's what you do. Life's an adventure. You do different things. You get bored, you do something else. But I began to realize that that's not really the case for everybody. Mm-hmm.
I'm really glad that you brought up your father. I mean, that was one of the things that was really, I remember when you gave your talk at Misfit about that, and that was one of the parts of the conversation that really stood out. This is something I don't think I've ever asked you, or anybody for that matter. I mean, can you talk about some of the early influences in your life that sort of shaped the creative parts of, the creative endeavors in your life?
Yeah, well, my dad is a huge influence and a huge part of really what shaped me on one side. And I really trace some of that back to what I learned in interviewing him from this book. Uh, Believe it or not, it goes back to farming. My grandparents were chicken and peach farmers in Yuba City, California, which is a small farming town up by Sacramento. Interestingly, I think we both know Ramit Sethi, and Ramit's family have roots also in Yuba City. One of those weird, kind of things you find out about your friends when you talk about your childhood. But when I was talking with my dad about his life and why it is that he's so passionate about community development and volunteering and restoring old buildings. One of the central stories in the book is for about the last 25 years, he and my bonus mom and other people in his really small community have been hand restoring essentially this 100-year-old school. And when I asked him about it, like, why would you do that? His answer was always like, that's just the way that it was. My grandfather's farm, or his dad, my grandfather, his father, he said, my dad his farm was always immaculate. He took great pride in the work that he did. I was always cleaning up around the farm. We'd always make sure that the front that met the road where people would drive by was always really clean. And I realized, like, hearing him talk about his dad was also a woodworker and did a lot of work in his shop. That was like where he loved to make things. He used to make things for my Aunt Shar, where, a little trivia fact, she's also Miss Beadle from Little House on the Prairie. And for David Lynch fans, she was in Eraserhead. Also in Tremors with Kevin Bacon. So she's 1 degree, I'm only 1 degree separation from Kevin Bacon. but when she was in high school, she would roller skate, and she'd be in roller skating competitions. And my dad talked about how he would watch his dad really enjoy making sets. He'd be in his shop, and he would make sets for my Aunt Shar when she was doing her roller skating. Now, interestingly, another really deep part of my family's history is there was a lot of alcohol that was drank. My grandfather was actually quite an unhappy person because he was going to school at UC Berkeley to be an engineer, and his father passed away, and he was forced by his family to come back and take over the farm. And he never really wanted to be a farmer. And this was a really interesting thing because he did take great care in how it is that he took care of the farm, but he was a pretty fundamentally unhappy person. And I think that really influenced my dad. I mean, the positive thing is he was influenced to care about his environment and take care of things. But on the other side, he saw what it was like to live with a parent that fundamentally did not want to do what they were doing day in and day out. And so my dad left the farm. He knew he didn't want to be a farmer. He went to University of the Pacific, which was then College of the Pacific in Stockton, and he was a journalist, and then he became a photographer. And, he really had great passion for the work that he did, and that was a really huge influence for me. So on my dad's side, there's gigantic influence in terms of hearing the stories about his own work and watching him do work he loved. My mom, on the other side, she didn't have that same relationship with work that my dad did. She did a variety of things. She was trained as a teacher, then she was a stay-at-home mom after my parents divorced. She, waitress, she worked in special ed, and then her later years working, she worked for Hospice of Marin, and she really enjoyed it. But her real passion was always about raising kids. I mean, I trust my mom's judgment more than anybody on earth when it comes to how to raise kids. She has a really nuanced way that she understands how to be a parent, and like being around her when she's around my kids, she's never bossy at all. She doesn't tell me how to raise them, but just the natural way that she kind of asks questions. She believes in kind of free range kids, right? You don't constantly cluck after them like, watch that, don't do that, don't hit that, don't do that. She believes in really like letting kids go do their thing, and then you just give these slight little, like questions or adjustments, or like distract them from doing something when they're doing it wrong. Now, I'm not as good a parent as she was because, I have my moments of yelling at times, as you'll know if you live next door to me. But she really influenced me that way in terms of being the kind of parent that I want to be.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. One of the things you said was that, your dad kind of saw what it looked like to have a life where you weren't excited about your work. And I think that's almost an epidemic at this point in our society. I mean, and your first book really addresses that. But what I love about where this conversation is going with this book is this whole kind of idea that it's no longer a career path, but, it's a body of work that we can do all these different things. But so, two questions come from me from kind of what you just said. One is sort of this notion of how we deal with this epidemic, and basically start creating, even if we're stuck to some degree, how we get unstuck. And then, you said your dad's, restoring an old building, and I remember you telling this story, and I think that when I hear something like that, one of the first things that comes to my mind is, wow, that is a really big undertaking for a creative project. And part of me thinks that there's got to be people who think, God, I want to do something that big, but I don't have it in me, and I'm wondering how you get past that.
Yeah, I mean, the epidemic of unhappy people. This is such a interesting question to ponder, because for many of us in the quit your job, start a business, be a misfit, be remarkable, of which I obviously am one of those people, and I love to have people like that around me. Here is the trap that we sometimes fall into. We become miserable, arrogant, tunnel vision. We think our way is the only way, in the same way that we can rail against the system for making people conform. And this is an interesting thing that I've really seen in my work in Escape from Cubicle Nation, which is one of the places that I want to bring us back in body of work, is in not obsessing over work mode. There's nothing inherently wonderful or liberating about working for yourself.
Yeah. I think that's an understatement.
Right? I mean, talk to somebody who is totally panicked about how they're going to pay bills, freaked out because they're new in an entrepreneur journey. Talk to somebody like my husband, who lived through a huge crash of the economy in 2008, right, in his business and construction. I mean, it is a really challenging thing to work for yourself. I love it. It is a work mode that, for me, totally matches who I am and how I do my best work. And part of that is what I've learned because I have worked in many different work modes. But I think one of the things that we have done is to glamorize the idea about, being remarkable or unconventional or being free and working for ourselves. And what we really get away from is understanding and respecting the fact that everybody has their own sacred journey with understanding themselves and their work. And for one person, the best possible choice that they may make is to decide to be a full-time stay-at-home mom, or to work for somebody else, or to start a $10 million business and totally kick butt and hang out with Richard Branson on, tropical islands. There is absolutely not one perfect way to be. And that's, I think, where we've gotten a little bit obsessed. And I think that's part of what there are people who really have found the path where they do feel connection and meaning with their work when they work for themselves. And that's fantastic, where they can really express that. There's a lot of other people that end up beating themselves up because they think they should want all that. And either it's hard or it doesn't work, or they don't really want it, but they think they should want it, just in the very same way that they think they should move up the career path and purchase a large house in the suburbs. You see what I'm saying? It becomes a similar kind of thing that we're searching for that isn't directly related to really what is our individual path. What is the way that we can actually be fully contributing to the world? So the place where I see that all of us can begin to make that connection with the kind of work that we're doing is focusing on creating and creating something, which I think is something we can all share and we can enjoy, that goes throughout many different work modes. I know that when I have family gatherings, and my brother and sister-in-law, who are isotope geochemists, work for University of Pittsburgh, they come together. My sister works for a large company as a writer and editor. I work for myself. Usually the places where we end up really getting excited is where we talk about what it is that we're creating, right? What are those areas where we have interesting projects that's, challenging, and we brainstorm that. That's the place that you can begin to find something. So yeah, you may not choose to spend 25 years as a volunteer hand restoring a large 100-year-old school. Like I tell my dad, a few crazy people do that, and he's one of them. But you can enjoy maybe picking up a camera for the first time in a really long time and just enjoy the process of taking pictures. Or you may really enjoy coaching your kids' sports team, and begin to get in the joy of creating and developing young, competent athletes, within the team or whatever it is. That's when I think you can begin to really connect with yourself. Or you write a book, or you do something that's engaging you with the creative process. I think that's really been the biggest lesson of this book is let's not worry so much about, career paths. And I think a lot of people just get stuck because they think they should be doing a whole bunch of things. They think once they go down one path, if they become a lawyer or doctor or engineer, or a very successful business person, that nobody's going to understand and it's impossible to make a shift. My whole point is, who cares? There's always a way to tell a good story about why it is that you're making different decisions in your life. The important thing is that you care about what you're actually creating and contributing to the world.
Mm-hmm. I love this. I mean, I think you've hit one of my personal hot buttons, and it's funny because Greg Hartle and I have talked extensively about this. He said, when we're talking about the internet, he said, you realize you live in a bubble. He said, go and see the rest of this country. And, he said, spend a day walking through Flint, Michigan, and, what we're up to probably doesn't seem all that relevant.
Exactly. It is Narnia, if you've ever read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And it is really easy to just get focused on that. And I'm exactly as delighted and intrigued as anybody else. For me, it was about 8 years ago when I first discovered the internet and people who were crazy entrepreneurs who were doing all these interesting businesses. And to this day, I get so excited. And it's such an interesting place to be, and I'm so thankful for it. But there also are a lot of other really fascinating, interesting people that are, all over the world that are doing really interesting things and creating interesting things. And there is there's a part, one of the I call it a root, that I've really found that is an important one to me, which is the bigger context for the kind of work that I want to do in the world, is that going back to when I was an undergraduate and doing economic development work, like I care about our communal benefit and growth and economic development. So if I just look in my own area within the Phoenix metro area here in Arizona, it's only going to be of benefit if large companies here are working with smaller companies that are working with freelancers, that are working with, government projects, that are working with nonprofits. The more that all of us are actually communicating with each other and doing work that's moving our entire economic engine forward, those are the kinds of conversations that I want to be in, and those are the kinds of things. And that's why sometimes if we are using language of vilifying one way of being, right, and making ourselves right, I just don't like that. I don't like it in politics. I don't like it in life, because what I care about is always working toward contributing something and making something better. And that's just something I've learned. I know a lot of people actually enjoy like negotiating and arguing online and stuff. Oh my God, I would rather do anything else. I just can't stand that. Like, okay, it just doesn't light my fire.
Yeah, no, I think that would exhaust me to no end. So you said two things that, you've talked extensively about work modes, and then you brought up this concept of everybody's individual sacred journey. So a couple of questions around this. In your own sacred journey, have there been sort of molding moments or sort of and tipping points that you've experienced? And then the other is once we're clear on what our work mode is, how do you have that sort of sacred journey play out within that work mode and create and contribute?
To me, it is, I think the sacred part of the journey is in recognizing that I do have a reverence for work. I do think that work is something that really makes us I don't know. It's where it's an essential part of life even if you end up winning a lottery or making a huge amount of money or selling your company or something, usually that you're not going to feel inherent satisfaction if you're just sitting around doing nothing, right? There's something about the act of working that I know I've always really enjoyed, starting at age 12 of working in an ice cream parlor, and just enjoying sweating and washing dishes and doing something. But the points I think that become tipping points and become significant moments are those moments when, for me, I've had the opportunity to feel what it's like to be doing work that I am truly meant to do, that is so enjoyable that I totally love doing it. So there have been many of those moments when I've been in coaching conversations with people. I mean, just the hair is standing on the back of my neck as I'm talking with somebody who has a deep realization that they can build a company, or that, the fact that they had a rough time and they have many battle scars does not mean at all that they are destined to be in one direction. I mean, there have been so many of those conversations throughout the years, and those are the times where I hang up the phone and I'm just grateful. I'm just grateful to be able to have those kinds of conversations because they're so powerful. The same thing has been true a lot of times in the writing process of even something as simple as writing a blog post that really, really was enjoyable to write, but also really resonated with other people. I remember one of the posts I included in the book was one I did for my friend Hugh McLeod from Gaping Void, and he did a series called You Less Than. And when you just kind of get in the flow. I got this image in my head of this photo that my dad had taken of me, and I was just transported into this journey of this story that I told. And it doesn't always happen that way sometimes in sitting down to write a blog post, but this post was just so enjoyable to write, and it felt vulnerable and open, but it also felt kind of cathartic. Mm-hmm. And so he published it on his blog, and he ended up getting a huge, great, positive reaction to it. And that was something that it's enjoyable when you have both sides of that. It was so enjoyable to do, and I think there's a whole bunch of other parts of my creative journey. But I remember in all the time that I studied capoeira, the Afro-Brazilian martial art that I did, it was part of my volunteer work journey of being a volunteer executive director. But I remember times where I would be in you call it the roda, the circle, with other people, and, actually involved in the middle of the art and hearing the music and, doing the movements, and you're transported into another place. And that's, another part of my creative journey. So those are the moments where I feel like I've had so many of them because I always have, part of it is a character flaw, honestly. I mean, like compared to my sister and brother, they are so much more able to do work that needs to be done. I can be very undisciplined. Like, if I don't want to do something, then I really, really have a hard time doing it. The good side means that I'm constantly gravitating toward work that is enjoyable. The downside is I am an adult who sometimes has to do stuff that I don't want to do, right? And I openly admit that. But there are many, many people who have never had that experience with work. Mm-hmm. Never had that moment of have you had those moments?
Not until this last couple of years. I mean, I can tell you in my corporate career, I mean, I if you read my Facebook update from this morning, I think it was titled the performance that had to come to an end because, I mean, as I was younger, you wouldn't believe the amount of times my dad would tell me, you're going to a job interview, make sure you act interested. And I thought, and I've thought about that over the years, and I thought, no wonder it didn't work out because I acted interested. The problem is if you get a job where you're acting interested, you have to keep acting. And so, yeah, I mean, now, obviously, with all the work that I've done, I mean, you definitely get that sort of that sense that, you were put here to do this. You can't imagine doing anything else.
Yeah, that's very profound. I mean, that I kind of just got chills as you were saying that. Really, that is very profound, and that's why it is so important how we do talk about work with with ourselves and how we think about it and how we how we parent. And what I believe so strongly is our parents that are giving us advice, or our grandparents, are doing it because they believe that they are helping us to be safe and well taken care of, to have a great life, right? I don't think any parent's going to intentionally try to sabotage their kid. I mean, maybe a few, but they're not very well, right? Mostly they're saying, like, this is what you need to do. You need to develop the kind of discipline, right, where you stick with one thing. If I had had different parents, it would be very interesting to see how I would have turned out. Right? Imagine if I had like a military kind of focus. I mean, there's many people in the military, but you know what I mean? Somebody who was like, don't quit, like, don't leave your corporate job, don't go by yourself and travel to Latin America, don't move to Arizona and marry Navajo. Like my parents, I was joking with Ramit when I was talking with him about this, Ramit Sethi, that I've never heard my parents ever tell me that they don't think everything I do is fantastic. And I'm sure sometimes they were thinking like, wow, that's kind of, unique. I don't really know where this is going. But they always just encouraged it so much that I think that's part of why I've been able to maintain this joy, and connection. And that's what I want. I mean, that's what I want for people. I know I sound like a total Northern California granola head life coach. I know that. And I am. I mean, I own that part of myself. But, the other part is I'm very pragmatic, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds of times now throughout the last 20 years of working with people that it really is possible to cross the bridge of feeling trapped and, stuck and things are not going to go in a good direction. And I've seen it so many times to where people really do change and blossom when they're put in a situation where they're able to do the right work. I remember I was doing a big project, a huge consulting project, and I was brought in to work in a department with somebody who's just a lovely person who was just a few years from retirement in the large company. And I could tell right away there was a certain dynamic that was happening there, where it's kind of like I was the outside consultant, but, maybe there was like a little bit of an agenda to maybe move the person out, and thankfully we developed a really good relationship. And she was able to open up and tell me, indeed, she had a great career, but had a bad performance review one year, right? And in some large companies, once you get that, it's like the total scarlet letter, right? You're targeted. And we did a lot of work to try to figure out strategically how it is that she could, maneuver within the organization and get to a better place. And she did. And she was able to save her career and her job and work, all the way out into retirement, doing something that she totally enjoyed. It was a really positive career shift, and like those kinds of experiences, which ended up completely changing the trajectory of her life. It would have had a really big impact if she would have ended up getting moved out, not just by ending her career on a really sour note, but also really strong financial implications, based on how her retirement dollars would have been after having spent a lot of time in a career. So I like to say, being a martial artist as well, I give advice and I totally spout off like a life coach, but I'm totally willing to take that into the octagon. You know what I mean? Like if I'm fighting against somebody who says,
So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable.
That's a bunch of, whatever, just follow a career path and stop talking about all these, life has meaning and you can enjoy your work. I really am willing to get down on the mat for that, because it is possible to do really great work and have a good, solid, financial situation if that's what's important to you, but also do work that's meaningful. I think it's possible for everybody.
Let's take a quick break and thank our other sponsor for today's show, Audible. Audible is offering Unmistakable Creative listeners a free audiobook of your choice and a free 30-day trial membership. With over 150,000 titles to choose from, you're likely to find books written by many of our former guests here at the Unmistakable Creative. So visit audible.com/creative and pick up a book written by one of your favorite former guests. Now, let's get back to the show. Well, one of the things you said as you were talking about this, you said, a situation in which you're doing the right kind of work. And, I've talked extensively with this people, and sometimes I think that one of the challenges where people find themselves doing work that isn't meaningful is that we've mismatched their talents with the environment that they're in. And that's something, that's, when I look back at my own experience, that's what I see is that, I was written off as somebody who wasn't interested in controlling my own destiny. That was what I was told. Which, if you look at how this has turned out, that's clearly not the case. But part of it, I think, was just a serious mismatch of talent and environment.
That's exactly what it is. And that's why it is this really, it's important to look at the process as one where you really do take ownership and responsibility for noticing and figuring out what are areas that you really are great at. Where do you have really powerful strengths? What kind of environment is the best to bring out the best in you? I've seen it over and over in the Escape from Cubicle Nation arena with coaching clients where somebody was really miserable in the work mode of working for somebody else. And then when they got out working for themselves, everything changed. Mm-hmm. I was talking with a client the other day and I was like, see, like when you were in the organization, I couldn't describe it to you. I couldn't explain how things were going to be different. And he was like, I know, like I totally get it now. I see what you were talking about. And that was a case where the work mode was a significant lever. Like I said earlier, it's not like that's not the magic solution for everybody. But when you can begin to pay attention to the times where you have the right set of circumstances around you, the right kinds of people, you can be an amazing business person and you can have like really, really great advice, but you get in the wrong audience and you feel like a complete and total loser because they're not connecting with you and they don't value you or your advice doesn't fit. And then you get with the right kind of audience and it makes such a difference. One of my clients was always a super talented therapist and psychologist, and she had a successful practice, but she was seeing a lot of young women who had, really low self-esteem, and she would do her very best to work in the context of being a therapist and a psychologist. But she really had an epiphany where she kind of crossed the bridge and said, in her case, it was particularly for Latina women. She was like, one of the reasons why we have this systemically as for young Latina women is because we don't see these powerful examples of strong leaders. And she ended up creating what she calls the AIA Leadership Institute, which is really strong, powerful Latina women business, women professionals that are working together. And it's just amazing to see the transformation of the impact that she can make. I mean, she's running events and she had Google sponsor and she's been all over CNN. And, it's just amazing to see the shift when she was able to put her strengths and her skills in the right place. The metaphor I use in the book is we all have our ingredients, right? But we need to find the right recipe. Mm-hmm. You need to find the place where like the right ingredients come together and create something extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that makes a perfect setup to really start talking more in depth. I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about work mode, but I really want to get into this idea of creating a body of work. That, like I had told you before we even hit record here, I felt that was one of the most liberating things that I'd ever heard. And as I sort of started to look at and survey people, people who I've interviewed, people who have created a lot of things, I look at this, I look at somebody like Seth Godin and I think, yeah, he's not defined by Seth Godin's blog. It just happens to be part of what he does. And then he has all these other things that become part of, what you effectively call a body of work. And I guess where I'm going with this is that, I think that once you get to some sort of central ethos or mission or message, then everything else is kind of an expression of that. So I guess that, you call the thread that ties everything together. When you look back in your life, and all the sort of careers you've had and all the things you've done, I mean, you've effectively created a body of work. I mean, what would you say that thread is, and then how do other people find it?
I mean, I think the thread, it both ties your past together, but then it also can be threads that help you look to what you're doing in the future. So one of the things where people can get caught who haven't found that a unified way to look at their body of work that makes sense to them, first of all, right, not to mention somebody else, is in thinking that you do find like a singular purpose. And that I think is one thing that ends up getting in people's way much more than it ends up helping, where we say, like, what's my mission in life? There are some people know it, and they have a nearly, religious experience with it, which is totally cool. That's what happens for them. But for many other people, it's not that way. So for me, it's beginning to notice what are really deep things that I care about, what are patterns that I notice throughout the different kinds of work that I have done. And one pattern that I notice over and over that went through martial arts work that I did and in community development in Latin America and training and development, executive coaching, startup coaching is about change and transformation, right? Always being interested in watching a before and after. Like nothing gets me more excited than those reality shows where you have like a total disaster area house and you take everything out and designer, builds new shelves and paints everything and you put it back and it totally looks different. Like that general pattern of transformation, being in a bad work situation, figuring out what works and relaunching in a new way is a thread that has always been throughout all of my work. So I can notice that that's something that consistently is going to be, a moving factor in my work and is part of my body of work, even though the output can be different. The other thing is really a passion and a connection with the underdog, with the unseen, with those that don't get the credit that they're deserved, with discrimination, with injustice, with things like that, has always been a very deep passion and interest of mine. And so in the work that I do, those become threads where I make sure whatever it is that I'm doing, I'm always holding that as a consistent value. So on my blog, where I'm not only featuring stories of beloved white men. Hey, my dad's a white man. My brother's a white man. I love them so dearly. I love all my white men relatives. Nothing wrong with them. However, there are more people in the world, right? So if I have the opportunity to be building a platform, I want to be showcasing people of different backgrounds and races and sexual orientations and, perspectives on the world. That's a way that I can really be weaving the thread, in this particular part of what I'm doing. So on one hand, there are ways that you can look back over your history and actually see it differently, right? In some ways, it can be a fun exercise where you look at all that you've created. If you've worked in an organization for a long time, you look at different projects you were involved in, or maybe what kinds of things did you get done? Did you launch websites or build code or whatever it is? And just begin to lay those things out on the table in addition to things that you did in your community, things that you did, in your personal relationships, volunteer projects, and begin to lay it all out. That's where sometimes you can see patterns, and retroactively you can begin to see where some of the threads were working that you weren't aware of. When you use it as a way that you can look forward, that's when I think it can help become certain decision criteria. And some of that is why a lot of the first part of the book is about doing some introspection about your roots. Like, what do you really care about? What do you actually value? What do you believe? What are things that get you totally riled up? Where do you want to really make a difference in the world? And when you define that, then that can be some decision criteria for how you're going to look at different opportunities, right? So if you have the next safe step in your corporate career that you secretly loathe and your whole body begins to shake when you think about it, but you think that's the responsible thing, right? And then you have this new interesting projects that you're really drawn to, you can look at that decision criteria and say, wait a minute, maybe this seemingly risky next step is the one that's more perfectly going to be aligned with really who I am and what I care about and where my natural strengths are. And I think the more you get used to making decisions based on that kind of criteria, you do end up seeing more success. I mean, and sometimes you fall flat on your face, but at least you're challenging yourself, right, to try out different situations where you're more likely to be enjoying what you're doing and really leveraging your strengths. And I just see it in my own experience and that with a lot of clients. The more you do it and you practice that, and you get kind of rigorous about what you say yes or no to, the better your quality of life becomes and the better quality your work becomes.
Yeah, I having experienced a lot of things I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's even learning to say no to things took me a really long time, and developing criteria, that was a really, really big one. But the thing that you brought up that I want to dig deeper into, you talked about how the output is different, could be different any times, and I also love that you brought up that there's introspection. One thing I've realized about introspection, or this sort of finding this purpose or message or mission, at least for me, I found that it's an evolutionary process. It's a complete process of inquiry, and it's not like I never have I don't ever have on my to-do list today. On my to-do list, the task is to find my purpose. You think that would be ridiculous? Like I think these questions are questions that we ask, and it takes often they're questions that in my mind have to bake, but the idea that the output could be different is something that I would love for you to expand on, because as I've thought about this, Simon Sinek came to me. He said, "I'll tell you what your why is." When we had a chat, he said, "You're completely enamored with people who are good at unusual things," hence the name The Unmistakable Creative. But it's played itself out in so many different forms. Like, one is in the form of a book, another is in the form of an event. Now I'm thinking, I could make a documentary film. So I'd love because I think that when we see this, our mindset is, okay, I'm a blogger and this is the thing I do. I am forever defined by this one thing. And then I go and look at somebody like AJ Leon. It's like, wait a minute, these guys do everything. Even though their business is a design agency, they have a T-shirt line that's part of their body of work.
Yeah, and so the area of interest is in how it impacts the quality of your creative output when you're conscious about that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I guess that, and also, I think that people are really trapped in the idea. Like, I think they have a very limited perception of what their output options are. Like, You listen to my show and you're probably thinking, okay, I'm going to go start a blog. And I'm thinking, well, if you have a message that would play itself out better in making a film, why don't you do that instead?
That's exactly right. And I think that is something that is the options that we have today around these things are radically different than they were, it feels to me, even 5 years ago 10 years ago, right? There's always been people who are just out there doing really cool, creative things. And my dad's one of them. I've just always, without having all the tools we have available. But now with the combination of free access to resource, like being able to learn just about anything in the world. If you're young, it's on YouTube, right? If you're old, then you go to Google. But it's we have access to learning so many things. But then also with crowdfunding, I think that's another really just different, unique opportunity. I had one client who used to be work for Disney, actually, and she is an artist, and she had this crazy idea she got married to an Argentinian, and she wanted to travel to all the provinces in Argentina and paint portraits of people, and just the interesting people, just the average person, right? The teachers and scientists and poets and everything. And so, like, kind of a crazy, wacky idea. But she did a Kickstarter project and raised $25,000. And when she started, she didn't really know what she was getting into when she started. And halfway through, she didn't exactly know what she was getting into and realized she may have been way over her head. But then when she had that focus on really being excited about it, and she engaged her community and she asked for help, she was actually able to do it. And I just think those things are totally amazing. I just think it's really amazing that we are able to do a lot of creative projects now. And the precedent has been set where, because we're sharing and we're communicating with each other, and the cost to entry is so much less, right? Making a documentary in the past, in order to have any kind of quality of filming, then we would need to have, really expensive camera equipment and stuff. Now you can probably do the damn thing on your iPhone. It's like
we're not far. We are not far. That's I found an app called Director the other day that does exactly that, and they even have a business version of this app, and I'll link it in the show notes for those of you guys listening. And I was thinking to myself, we're not far from being able to make feature-length films from our phone. I think in the next 10 years, that's going to happen.
Exactly. So for what we consider to be like creative output, it's all creative output, right? I mean, it really is. When you think about it, it comes out of our head and we make something. So that's all creative. But for people that are driven to want to write a book or make a film or, record an album or whatever, like that is where I think we're at a very unique time in history. And that's where the term body of work has obviously been used for a very, very long time. We do tend to often attribute it to just people in the creative professions, like photographers or artists, fine artists, or things like that, writers. But what becomes really interesting to me is where we attribute it to all of us. And it basically is just that which we create throughout the course of our lives, and the tangible things and the intangible. And this is part of where I also feel lots of passion and excitement personally about this kind of definition, because it can validate for some people who never really cared so much about writing the next great novel or, traveling somewhere and making a documentary, but that is passionate about being a certain kind of parent or being a certain kind of neighbor, and just relishing and enjoying the conversations that they have with the local folks that are at their corner pub. To somebody who really has that as a focus, where they really put their creative energy into, as an example, building really profound relationships, that's a very powerful part of their body of work, right? For the people who have been touched by that can be an amazing life-altering experience. So I just read about a story that was around on Facebook of this teacher who loved teaching, and he got ill quite a few years before he stopped teaching, and he had to quit once he got really ill. But he decided to go on the journey of visiting his high school students. I think he taught in Miami or something, and he just wanted to see how his teaching had impacted them as people. And the stories, I can hardly tell the story without getting choked up about it, because he went all across the country and he talked to these students, and he said, the main thing, they were impacted by what it is that I taught. I think he was an English teacher, and he evoked a passion, for writing and so forth. But he said the thing that most people really said they appreciated the most was just the time that I spent with them, those little moments where I actually acknowledge them and spend some time with them and make them feel good. And those are those moments, my God, for how many teachers are there on the planet where those moments are those that are absolutely defining for somebody, some kid in that moment who came from a really shitty family background, right, who needed an adult to care in that moment. And that for them is going to be a defining moment that ended up totally changing the trajectory of their lives. I want to honor those kinds of choices that we make about bodies of work, and not just worship at the altar of who's created a multi-million-dollar business, right? Or who's written the next best-selling book.
Mm-hmm. I love this. Then this is why I wanted to have you back, because I knew that there's something very special to me about this message. When I remember when I heard you talk about it at the Misfit conference, and then when you sent me the book, I thought to myself, I said, this is something that has been missing from our conversation for a really long time. We've kind of, nobody's really talked about it this way. And I think the idea that, hey, I think back to something Amber Ray told me. She said, a friend of hers said that, your calling and the expression of your calling can be two completely different things.
Nice, yes.
And I really, and that's kind of the message I want people to take away, because I see, as you may have caught, like I wrote this lengthy update called the Mimicry Epidemic on Facebook, and of course tons of people had something to say about it. And to me, this is the way out of it. Like, this is the way you get out of it, is to say, what could I do? I love that I always say the advice is ingredients and the recipe is yours. And, when we look at how we did everything we did with our rebrand, I think it was literally, let's take the hundreds of ideas that we've received from our guests over the years and let's mix them up in a way that nobody else would think to do. And of course, I think that the idea that I'll be forever defined by this one thing is something that that I'm over now, and to hear it put this way, at least I hope it will be liberating for people, because it, in my mind, it frees you up to explore the fact that you may have talents you don't even know are there, or that have been completely lost.
Exactly. And you don't know. A lot of it is tied to when is the right time in your life in order to use those talents. And you don't, much like if you're climbing a mountain and you don't really see the next one until you get over the crest of the top of that hill. That's one of the things I enjoy so much about getting older, is that I do see, oh my gosh, like if I were 27 instead of 47 doing these things, I wouldn't have done them the same way. I wouldn't have had the same kind of realization. And so in that way, everything has its right time. And you're right, it's hard to let go of things, sometimes even more, that have been successful, where you get very known for a certain brand or a certain thing that you do, and to know that, it's okay. I mean, anything, it is always going to be part of your body of work. Nobody can take that away from you, what it is that you have created. But you know that you're ready to begin to shift and create something else when you feel that you don't have that same kind of connection with it. I remember one of my mentors talking about seeing Jimmy Buffett, who maintains this incredible way to sing Margaritaville with the same kind of passion and connection. Like, can you imagine if you're the Rolling Stones and you're singing Brown Sugar for the 12,000th time, to a stadium full of people? You can see some bands who are able to continue to stay connected with a mission, or maybe they love performing so much, or maybe they get high off of people experiencing the music, and so they can still stay creative. You see the difference with those that are not connected anymore, who are just totally dialing it in. And that's where it's like, dude, get off the stage. That's not your only time, right? There are other things you can do, which is why I was so happy to showcase John Legend, in my book, as one example of somebody, right, who's an amazing, talented musician. He's still a young dude, so I can imagine he still has so much more left in what he's doing. But, even when he started on his music journey, he was a management consultant, but he got all kinds of business skills. He's a philanthropist. He's interested in education and does television shows and all these different things. I love to see examples like that, because we don't, professional sports people. I was talking with Fran Tarkenton, who was the old quarterback in the NFL, who's been in business and he's been in radio and always reinventing himself. And that's what I think ends up keeping us both creatively alive and healthy and active. But also protects us from getting stuck in some sad caricature of how we were at our prime in 1984 or something. And that's when we start doing plastic surgery and, life starts to go down. You probably weren't even born in 1984, so.
I was, actually.
Okay. For those younger whippersnappers.
Yeah, I'm sure there are some people, there are definitely people listening to this. And that's, anytime we make 80s pop culture references, I always have to think, some of you listening weren't even around. Yesterday we were going by the Top Gun house. I'm like, I bet I have people in my audience who've never seen Top Gun.
That's right.
So, well, Pam, this has been really awesome. So I'm going to close with my final question, which I always tried to find ways to vary this question up, but it's interesting. I guess in the context of a body of work, when you look at people who have created, what we look at as successful bodies of work, are the authors, the artists we admire, the people who go out and do these crazy public works projects. I keep hearing somebody referenced a guy who built the skyline in New York. I don't know if it's the skyline or the High Line. I keep forgetting. But I mean, that's a 10-year project, which means somebody saw something and was willing to put 10 years into something that massive. And I mean, even your dad is a perfect example. What do you think it is that separates a person who can take on such gargantuan projects within their body of work and bring them to life from the ones who don't, who can't do that?
I think it is, first of all, people who are really willing to bet on themselves, that do believe that the work that they are doing in the world makes a difference, and they're willing to really figure out, really like do their work in order to, figure out how to break creative blocks and, value themselves. It's so Saturday Night Live cliche that, we're good enough, we're smart enough, and doggone it, people like us. But you know what? There's nothing like that. When you do fundamentally love yourself and you believe in your mission, I think that is something that is really important fuel. But ironically, those that do end up, in my experience, creating the kinds of things that are the most significant in the long term are those that enjoy every single step and that don't look and say, I'm going to spend the next 25 years doing this, but just look ahead of them and say, my God, this is so interesting. I totally think this is cool. We should do this, like my dad did so many years ago when, as a nonprofit, they bought the school, and just enjoyed each step of the process. It's everyday execution. Everyday execution. And that's where I see people that really fall by the wayside. If they just get lost in wanting to do everything at the same time and kind of gulp it all in, and then they never make it. They just don't pace themselves.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very critical point. I mean, as I'm putting together the bits and pieces of the Instigator experience, I'm like, wow, I'm talking to shuttle providers and caterers. I really am planning the wedding that I'm not going to have a wife at the end of. But I'm realizing, to me, even though those little tiny things, they're not great, I found that, okay, this is way more manageable if I break it up into hundreds of pieces. And by the time April rolls around, I get to see the fruits of my labor.
Exactly. And if you don't get some kind of weird pleasure at just checking those small things off your list, then it is hard to really see it through, in the long term. But that's how things get done. That's how things get done. And to me, the true measure of life is enjoying it while you're living it, feeling good at the end of the day, even if it was a rough day, knowing that it's worthwhile what it is that you're doing.
Awesome. Well, Pam, like I said, I was absolutely thrilled to have you back. To me, this message is one that I've wanted to share with our audience here at the Unmistakable Creative for some time, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and share some of your insights with us.
Thank you for having me back. I truly, truly appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Today's episode of the Unmistakable Creative has been brought to you by Selz. That's SELZ.com. Selz gives you the freedom to sell from any website quickly with no programming, no special templates or special themes needed, while giving your customer a completely seamless experience.
Thanks for listening in on another candid conversation at the Unmistakable Creative. Embrace your inner misfit. Express your creative voice. And remember, the goal isn't to live forever, but to create something that will.